everybody. Welcome back. Welcome in. We are doing a beautiful clinical workshop tonight. And we just raced in a couple of seconds ago. We're up in Whistler right now. And so I was, I don't know, don't tell anybody, but I was like driving so very fast. And we made it with 2 minutes to spare. So there you have it. And we're going to dig in tonight into, I think, something that is probably super important to so many of us, but I think we don't spend a lot of time talking about. And it's where we spend the most amount of time in our relationships. And so I'm going to give you a few disclaimers before we jump in. And if you're new here, just so you know what we're talking about tonight, love and marriage. We're going to talk a little bit about like what it means to stay in a committed relationship these days and why for so many of us, it is so difficult. And why does it seem to be getting difficult? Why are relationships different than they've been historically? And or why do they seem to be different? And the truth is, so many of our needs to stay connected are exactly the same. Nothing's changed. Okay. But the ways in which our opportunities to connect to each other and to disconnect from each other have never been so much in flux. So you'll see in the side of this, I can see your chat now. And if you have any questions along the way, we always save 30 minutes for question and answer. So if there's any questions or any comments you want to put into the chat, you just put it there. Marty and Des are both going to be watching. So I'll dive into those. If there's any questions that we have by the end of the night. Oh my God, can you see that the hockey game is on in my reflection of that picture? Okay, just so you know, that's happening because I know you're all watching the Oilers. No, I don't know that you're all watching the Oilers game, but anyway, the point is that we're going to talk a little bit about some hard things tonight, but I really want you to drop your shoulders and lean in with me. Every month I do a clinical workshop, except for July and August. So this is the last one that we're going to do for a little while. But when we started this process, it was always like, I think mental health resources are really hard to access for so many people. And so every month we wanted to dive into something related to mental health and relationship and mental wellness so that we could just dive in and have a chat about it. So, of course, when relationships are the crux of everything we talk about. But I want to give you a couple of disclaimers. So the resources and insights tonight are only meant to be suggestive and are not intended to be considered therapeutic interventions, as context is necessary in every situation where opinions or advice are given directly. You'll see that I have attached a list of resources of places where I'd like you to, if you need to find more information about tonight or just a summary of what I'm going to talk about, all of that is connected here. And when we talk about marriage and relationships tonight, these can involve different combinations. So there's no right way to do this, and certainly legally recognized or otherwise, they all matter more than anything now. So including opposite sex, same sex, or polyamorous relationships. Typically, these are with the fellow humans you interact with the most and who tend to have the greatest influence on how you show up in your adult world. So none of these insights or suggestions apply if you and or your babies or anybody involved in a system are not safe. Ongoing active experiences of violence or threats to safety make it impossible to stay connected. If you are not safe or fear for your safety, calling 911 for assistance or a local domestic violence hotline is always your first stop. So what I want to talk about tonight is, first of all, everything that I created for you today happened back on Treaty 7 land. Despite the fact that we're in a different territory tonight, everything I created for you happened on Treaty 7 land, which is now known as the center part of the province of Alberta, and it was home to the Blackfoot Confederacy first. It is, the Blackfoot Confederacy is made up of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3. It is always important to my team and I that we acknowledge the lens on which we get the privilege and the honor of sharing work that I think can not only change lives, I think it can save them. So on that note, I'm glad you're here. And I think, let's kick it off for sure. When we talk about relationships these days as being harder than now, because conversations become texting, arguments become phone calls, and feelings become status updates. I saw that little meme someday, and not very long ago, and I was like, "Oh God, isn't that true?" Relationships these days are harder now because conversations become texting, arguments become phone calls, and feelings become status updates. And I thought that I would just open into this, the truth these days. Okay, so this is a quote. It's actually one of the first lines in Feeling Seen, and I say it quite often in the things that I talk about. We look all the time these days, but we rarely see. We listen, but we don't hear. And in this world where there's so much noise, we've been missing more and more these days the thing that matters most. We were never meant to do this alone. And I just want to take you on a bit of a journey. I mean, I think because um, what is true about the human race is that there's two rules actually of the human race and whoever created us. This is certainly, as a clinical psychologist, what I've come to believe to be true. There's huge, over the last 20 years, two rules to the human race. Number one, we are neurobiologically wired for connection. Okay, we will not in this lifetime and multiple lifetimes after us, if ever, automate relationship. If you disconnect from an infant, they die. Okay, the healthiest, what we know to be true, is the healthiest among us, those who live the most longest and mentally well lives. The greatest predictor is the capacity for social integration. Some relationship prospects are what keeps us the healthiest. Okay, because we can't make sense of hard things alone for long. We can't understand the inundations, the innuendos, the things that are happening in this world without checking them with somebody, bouncing them off somebody, referencing somebody. In our very big overwhelm moments, we often can't get ourselves back together in a healthy way, in a quick way, if we don't do that in the context of relationship. Okay. And then the second rule is this: despite the fact that we're neurobiologically wired for connection, number one, the second rule is that the hardest thing, whoever made us said this, the hardest thing that you're ever going to do is look at each other. Which, like, as a rule that I've come to learn to be true, doesn't seem like that difficult, right? But when you think about the fact that we are neurobiologically wired for connection, and the hardest thing we will ever do is look at each other, and we've never had so many opportunities to look away in this season, we're probably going to be in trouble. Because part of the issue is, if I want to maintain a solid relationship with another, particularly when shit gets hard, I want to have the capacity to stay connected. Now, if I can look away, if I can walk away, if I can land my heart in other places, it makes sense to me that we're probably entering a season where the rules, the typical rules of relationship, have to change. And or we will have to be able to connect to the people that matter the most on purpose. Staying in a healthy, connected relationship is going to take more work in the generations that follow. And I think it will result in many questions of the typical relationship. Okay. Now, I want to tell you, like, the state of marriage these days is, I was thinking a lot about this. Okay. Many people, many of us meet each other online. In fact, I've been married to my personal husband. We've been together for 15 years now. We met online, like in the rudimentary stages of online lava life, MSN chatting, where you had to be at a dial-up computer and wait for the message to come through. Okay. So I sent him a heart. He sent me a heart. It took a fucking long time to set up the whole deal. But we are the first generation of people who have had access to social media and have had the capacity to meet online. So what is interesting about this is that there's no context in that initial meeting, and it presents it with so many difficulties that we haven't yet developed scripts for. What we won't automate is authentic interaction. And this is the new thing. I'm kind of like, I'm going to try on a few things that I'm thinking about lately tonight with you, because I think that the AI that will save organizations and relationships is authentic interaction. I think that AI is the thing that, if you understand the importance of stepping into somebody authentically, if you really understand the importance of being vulnerable with somebody. This is how, and I'm going to jump to the middle part of this talk, but I'm going to tell you this real quick because it's on my head. I think this is how we know when a relationship is nearing its end, when it becomes very difficult to get back to that authentic, if at all possible. If I think about couples who come and see me, if I can't get you back to that authentic knowing of another, that vulnerability, there's too many walls. Okay. So let me just take that back just a little bit. Okay. The idea of being able to be in a relationship, you know, Esther Perel, who I've put some of in the resources, I've talked a little bit about this process. Esther Perel says the quality of your relationships determines the quality of your lives. And it is probably one of the most referenced quotes for her. And I think she's one of the foremost people, her, the Gottmans, any of these people that I would reference in our resources here probably have this relationship thing figured out the most. And the quality of our relationships determines the quality of our lives. And I think it's like our capacity to stay regulated in times of distress becomes one of the greatest predictors of staying healthy in a relationship. Now, the inundation of social media suggests to so many of us how it should be. And I don't know that we've given enough attention to the fact that we are trying to build and maintain relationships in an era that we didn't start in necessarily. We didn't watch our parents try to navigate this. We don't have a script for the ease and accessibility of other people to fill connections when we feel isolated. When we find someone who makes us feel safe and cared for, that's great. But we now have never had so many opportunities to be like, are we settling? Is there something else out there? Because we can see so many opportunities everywhere. And Esther Perel has this beautiful line that in one of her most recent talks, she said, when we find someone who makes us feel safe and cared for, we often feel like we're settling, but we've been hacked, she says, because consumerism in love has been one of the most difficult inundations into modern love, which means it's so easy to be fed an algorithm that there's so many more opportunities there. They're so easy to sort of be inundated by data that, like, does your partner do this? Here's the 16 red flags. You should find something else. Be an independent, so like all the things, which is true. We often think, I don't have enough, I'm not enough. And it really leads to, I think, the sense of a crisis of self-worth. And why this is important is because if I need you to be connected to another human being, the critical phase is, the critical focus is you. Do we have enough confidence, competence, self-worth in a human body to be able to stay physically and authentically present with another human being? If that is compromised, it will be very difficult to do the work. And what I think about quite often in this very noisy, disconnected world is that slowing down long enough to look and to see with another human being is the biggest challenge we're going to be faced with. Because here's the trick in couples relationship or couples therapy. Okay. And so I often talk about this on stage, but I'll tell you, one of my favorite models in doing couples work, whoever that is, trying to decide if a relationship is worth the fight or if it's run its course, is Sue Johnson's work called emotion focused therapy. And she really talks about the dance of intimacy, which is, I think, originated by a psychologist, one of my favorites, called Harriet Lerner. I think I linked her book, and here's one of the oldest books that I've ever referenced, that I always reference in therapy. But it's called the dance of intimacy because it's really a dance of being able to understand and see others' patterns, understand where they're coming from, the stories of why I might feel like, you're being condescending when really you're trying to do everything for me because you think that your job is to save me from my pain and my job is to actually experience it. And so I used to really like this about you, but now you're fucking controlling and overwhelming. The dance changes when different stages of our life get introduced. And so much of the trick in this space, if there's a trick, is really being self aware of our dance, of our story, of what it felt like in our seasons of um, being in relationship with other people. Because oftentimes, Danae Logan, who I'm going to talk a lot about tonight, I'm just really, really interested in her work right now. She's going to be on the podcast. We've already had an interview, so coming up, she's going to be on the podcast. But she's just written a book called Sovereign Love, that I'm really interested in. And talking about oftentimes we enter into relationships healing the wounds of previous relationships, often those, in the families in which we grew up in. And there's something that at one point we are often very attracted to, but if we don't stay connected to the changes, the triggers, the things that happen in our own lives, our partners become the sole person who we expect to handle so many things for us. This is the generation we've come from. Find a partner, they will be everything and do everything and be a part of everything for you, right? For better or for worse, you're going to be the sunshine when I rise, the sunset when I'm going to be with you when your football team wins. I'm going to support you when you have the children. I'm going to be everything and everything to you. That's so fucking dumb, because it's ridiculous to think that one human, particularly in a modern relationship, can do all of that regulating for you successfully for a very long time. First, because we've never had this much lack of proximity to each other, okay? And one person is not that good. We often spend a whole lot more time together. So let me give you some of the data, okay? So what I would say, with respect to Danae's work is like curiosity remains the critical piece of staying connected with another. Rarely does anybody fall into a flame of fire and never, ever get out of it, right? It always dies away. The idea of curiosity becomes completely obliterated when we have so many other opportunities, data, information coming into our bodies, okay? Sifting through that, I think, is going to become the primary work. Love stories happen so much easier than life stories. And it's so much work. There's two things that I think are just such farces in this world. People do not and maybe cannot tell you how hard it's going to be to make relationships work, or how hard it's going to be a parent, which of course parenting is involving the relationship with your children. The relationship with a significant other or others, whatever that looks like, is the greatest amount, will require the greatest amounts of self-reflection in your world. And if we stop the self-reflecting process and spend a lot of time pointing at the other one, your relationship will be difficult. Now, I'm not to say, let me be very clear. This isn't about you're the problem. We need to fix you, everybody. Our greatest work in the evolution of our relationships will come when we look inward. And I would say probably 70% of the people that I see every time we start therapy, we start talking about the other. He's a narcissistic son of a bitch. They're always in control. They don't give a shit about me. They've had multiple affairs. They're shallow. They're cringy. They're yucky. They're all of these kind of things. They just drive me nuts. Yeah. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is wrong with another through the eyes of the person in front of me. And although it's important, I think, to sort of contain that emotion and wonder what that must be like, and acknowledge how difficult it is to be in this situation where it feels, and potentially is a narcissistic controlling relationship. Most of our work will always shift back to the person willing to be in that session, to understand how they got there and how they get out of it, or how they make it better, or how they heal that process. Very few life stories happen without a love story. And that's Esther's work. And I really love that. It's like you got to decide in some ways if this life story is worth kind of navigating and being curious enough to step back into what the dynamic has introduced, right? Because it's so, what I think is very interesting, if we look about the stages of most relationships, right? There is this sense when we start in many relationships that there is a connection, a desire to be with each other. You think about each other often, you spend time together with each other. The idea of, having sex frequently or engaging physically, you just touch each other and things change, in your neurochemistry. It's also the very clear story for all of us that dissipates after a couple of months, a couple of, it's usually months, but like it can be a couple of weeks, it can be a couple of months, and either that, fades off or it comes back together. Now, theoretically speaking, for the vast majority of us, we date far more people than we marry. And so that process of initial attraction, figuring out that initial connection, whether it goes further, often depends on so many things. Do our stories align? Do we have the capacity to communicate with each other? Was something introduced in terms of a family system intervention, or we got pregnant, or something happened in that process that either continued that relationship or not? There's very few data, very little data that would suggest there's a right way to do this, because what I think is much more predictable of longevity is the capacity for individual curiosity in the relationship and the ability for reflection. And whether you can grow together or not, or assist in the growth of each other, becomes really critical in this process. So, if we look at just simply the numbers, I think this is fascinating. Most people in the world still identify as married. Many more are cohabitating, but many still would identify more than anything as being married. And I think that sorry, I'm just getting back to my notes. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing a question. 40%. Okay. And so this is the data around it, right? So we know that being in a marital relationship is a 50-50 shot most of the time, whether it's going to work. 40 to 50% of first marriages fail. Separations don't count in divorce statistics. So we know that a lot of times people take breaks or step away from each other and may or may not, end that separation in divorce, or they may never formally divorce, and so that's never a statistic. We also don't account for the people who stay together for a long time and are very unhappily cohabitating or in a marriage. And we put a big emphasis in this culture on longevity. So if you've ever been, I don't know if you've ever seen this at a wedding where people, they call people onto the dance floor and they're like, step away from the dance floor if you've been married for 10 years or less. Okay, 20 years, whatever. And so like you see people that, have achieved milestones of 30 years together, 40 years together, 50 years together. I think Aaron's grandparents were married for 60 some years together. Okay. But there isn't, there's a lot of celebration in that longevity, but there hasn't historically been a lot of questions about, how hard has that been? What has there been thoughts of dismantling the marriage? What was there ever a time when, because we still put a massive divorce is seen in this experience, still in this lifetime, is a failure. The ability to not maintain that relationship, despite the fact that we are getting much more clear on, authenticity is much more important than attachment sometimes. We are still very much in this place that divorce is a failure, even more so if infidelity is part of the picture. And the main marker of success, and I was reading this the other day too, which I think is interesting. The main marker of success is not longevity. Divorce does not have to indicate failure. People change, losses, they overcome all the things. Divorce is not necessarily the end of a family. It's a reorganization of a family. And I think that's one of the things we're going to see when we sort of navigate, in this next sort of modern sense of relationship, because I think we are struggling more and more in this place. Because if we see 50% of this, 60% of second marriages fail, 73% of third marriages fail. And so it begs the question, right? what don't we get about this process? And I think there is the idealization of being able to fall into that initial phase that feels so good about connection and openness and authenticity that is readily available in those first few months, even years, is the thing we're chasing, that feeling of connection. And the idea is that remaining curious and doing your work to be able to stay in a place to make a relationship, to be vulnerable enough, is where the work I think really comes. So it's also interesting because lack of commitment is 73% of the identified cause of the dismantling of marriages. And I think that, so some of the data right now is really interesting. We are in a new era, we would say, of relationships. The couple has never before been such a central unit in our societal organization. So our grandparents, just one generation ago, entered into marriage as a pragmatic institution. And it was sort of for the physical safety, often orchestrated by family systems. It was for the physical safety of communities. You needed to create children to be able to move forward a family name. And so today, just one generation, maybe two, the basic needs of procreation have moved up the hierarchy, and the needs of self actualization become more important. So it's not about procreating so much anymore as it is really finding yourself in a relationship so that you can offer this world the best parts of you. So what we used to do, or I would say one or two generations ago, was that there was so many opportunity. You were building a family, you had family systems around you. And what Pearl would say more than, I love this quote by her. She said, we are asking from one person what an entire village used to provide. We are asking from one person what an entire village used to provide. So more specifically, as almost all of our communal institutions give way to a heightened sense of individualism, right? We needed previously to be collective in so many things we do. The farmer, we needed you to bring your fucking hoe over your, let's maybe use a different word. We needed you to bring your rake over so that I could borrow this. We need all the hands to clear these trees. We need all the things. And now this individual competitive nature is much more, I think, the name of the game. We look more frequently to our partner to provide the emotional and physical resources that a village or community used to provide. And further, I think it's never been this easy to search for or find somebody better out there. So now, the point is still, I think we assume today that marriage is between two people, but it's still very much between two families. They just are typically not as physically present. Their opinions are still very much a part of the game because we're still connected to that ideal. But their physical ability to support or to provide a sense of regulation is becoming more and more thwarted. And I often think about the fact that, I'm going to show you this data real quick. I don't know, Des, if I have the access. I put this in your resources, but I want to show you this data real quick if I can. Let's see if I can share my screen. Because I put it in your resources, but I wanted to show my window. There it is. Okay. Take a look at this. Okay. This is some interesting data. Okay. So when we take a look at the time spent with family, this is Esther stuff. This is hours per day. So the source is the Time Use Survey. I think I've referenced it in the resources, but this is time, hours of day, time spent with family. Okay, so look at your age. How much time you spend with your family of origin dissipates quite significantly over, when you become a teenager. Here's your time spent with friends. Okay, 1 to 2 hours a day when you're younger. That's the deal, right? Even as we age, you can see a slight uptake, but that changes. Time spent with partner as we age tends to increase significantly. And I find this fascinating. Time spent with our babies massive influx, of course, when we have them in our 20s and 30s and 40s and they need all of this regulation, that decreases significantly. And you look at the time with partner and the time with children. What often tends to be very interesting when kids are introduced into a system, it changes the dynamic. It is one of those times where face to face connection, partner to partner, you were my connector to many things. Now we're dissipating those relationships among one, two, three, however many children you have, rewriting that relationship again when those babies leave, in your 40s, for many of us, and into your 50s, is different because the time with partner extends significantly. And Bloom, who reviewed some of this data, said, listen, family time is unlimited or is limited, cherish it. Okay, so early. Friend time is limited, prioritize real ones. Partner time is significant. It may be one of the most important decisions you make, and probably one of the most important pieces to invest in, because you are expected to spend, not expected, you do spend so much time with these individuals, even today. Okay. Do I want to save those? No, I don't. So I am so, the slides didn't move. Oh, sorry, Mary. Okay, well, I hope that you can see that. And if not, they're in your resources, so you can take a look and reference there in terms of just what I was talking about. What I think is so fascinating, right, is that the ability to reflect and have a connection, to stay emotionally regulated in this process becomes really interesting. Okay. Now, what I think is so fascinating, even over one generation, is that we have really moved to this place of role clarity, not having any role clarity, right? Love is this active verb. Instead of I'll honor and cherish you and hopelessly be devoted to you for the rest of my life, should be more like I'll fuck up regularly and occasionally I'll admit it. I think that I'm going to read you this little passage from Danae's book, because I was reading it this last couple of weeks on the plane or the days as we were traveling. And this piece of it, I think, is really interesting. She says, one of my favorite phrases from the spiritual teachings of Abraham Hicks is when they periodically joke that their perspective on long-term relationships would sound something like, I like you pretty good. Let's see how it goes. And while for many of us, this level of ambiguity, let's say, does not provide enough containment to feel fulfilling, the larger truth I believe they are alluding to is that the sense of certainty we believe we've been offered within the boundaries of a marital contract is always an illusion. People die. People fall in love with someone else. People change their minds about what they want. And sometimes relationships are meant to expire. It is an uncomfortable truth for us to sit with, but a truth that is nevertheless based in the reality of potential marital outcomes. The resistance to opening our hearts and minds to the possibility of uncertainty is not only what causes our deepest suffering when and if these shifts do occur, but it can hold us back from facing the truth head on. And without truth, we end up swimming against life's current, making it impossible for us to be carried downstream to where we are ultimately meant to go. What I love the most about that is that to be in a healthy, connected relationship, being able to understand our responses to the changes in the dynamics, when kids come, when they leave, when an affair has happened, when we don't feel as though we're desired anymore, we often make so many assumptions, and we don't have the bravery, the capacity, the skill to bring in that vulnerability in that conversation in a way that I think is only going to become more difficult. Why I think it matters is it is going to be important to know that you are with somebody who you want to navigate the latter stages of your life with. when you travel, when you get sick, when you have the big things that start to come, right? The navigating parents' sickness, illness, death, being able to sort of, I think, work with some of those big emotions in times of biggest distress. What we want is predictability and safety and comfort. And oftentimes, you can't replicate that with somebody to the same degree that you have had children with, or you have went through major life stories with, right? It doesn't mean you should be with them, but nobody will replace that knowing. And continuing to stay connected in that knowing, whether you stay married or you stay in a relationship or not, if you, particularly if you have children, uh, will become, I think, one of the greatest feats of the next generation. How do we stay in an authentic, open place with the people that we become intimately interconnected with? That intimate interconnectedness will not change. It is the neurobiology of all of us. Okay. But when I think about the loneliness epidemic that is upon us, and everybody says, not everybody, but people ask all the time, right? Are we in a mental health crisis, right? The domestic violence, child maltreatment, rates of anxiety, depression, all those things seem to be so ridiculous these days. We're in a mental health crisis. No, I don't think we are. I think we are in an understandable response, an understandable human response to a loneliness epidemic. Okay, let me give you the definition of loneliness. Okay, because I put this in a slide yesterday when I was speaking to a bunch of firefighters, firefighter chiefs, and I looked up this definition of loneliness because I was like, what is the deal? Lonely is an adjective. Of course, it's a feeling. It's a descriptor of something, but it's so much bigger because when it lives in your body, there's a big difference between feeling alone and feeling lonely. Alone is a state of being. When I'm alone in a room, it means nobody else is here. When I'm alone in my job, it's because I have been chosen as the person that whatever. Lonely is a feeling that really cannot be dictated, even if you're in a room of thousands of people. You can be alone and feel lonely, but you can also be with many, many people, many noisy inundation of 6,000 friends on Facebook and lots of opportunities to connect. And you have a job you go to, and you can feel remarkably lonely. And loneliness is defined as an unpleasant emotional response to perceived isolation. When I don't feel seen, when nobody seems to authentically connect to me, get me, that's where loneliness lives. And if I think about then the thing we just said, the healthiest relationships among us are the ones in which we are able to maintain the bravery of authenticity, of checking, can I get back to your soul? Those moments, you could live with somebody for years and years and years and have very few opportunities of truly seeing their soul. And this is the thing I love the most about couples work is when I was, speaking about emotion focused therapy, my only job in couples work. And let me say, I'm so much better doing this with other people than I am with my own husband. Because I think, in our very busy lives, the rarity that Aaron and I could say, we really become authentically connected with each other is difficult because things are so noisy. And the only point in a couples therapy session for me, and other therapists differ significantly, is to slow down long enough and get two people to look at each other. It is so hard to get two people to look at each other. I can't even tell you. It sometimes takes me multiple sessions. It sometimes can't happen. They would rather spit vitriol at each other. I don't even know if you can spit vitriol, but like they would rather do this, which is sometimes necessary. Like we got to get it out, all those things. That's necessary sometimes. You got to name it to tame it idea. But the softening of turning to each other is often the art that I think is in a therapeutic practice. Because One of my jobs is often to get both of them regulated at the same time, which is tricky. If there's anger, if there's fear, if there's uncertainty, if they don't want to hear what the other is going to say, if they feel like they can't trust the other, getting to the place that is probably the biggest work for many therapists is creating that sense of safety so that you can turn to each other. Okay. So sometimes it looks like this. I will say, what brought you here? Tell me about this person. What's amazing about them? Why did you first meet? And they'll be like, I don't know. Like I always tell the story because this happened in therapy a couple times to me. I don't know. Got pregnant in a bush party. I had to marry her. I'm like, oh, fuck. Okay. So we got to back it up even further, right? What was it about this human, right? You've been together 30 years, or you've been together 15 years, or I don't even care about the number. What was it about this person? And oftentimes people say, well, that was long ago. It doesn't matter anymore. She's a bitch now, or he's an asshole because he's, done this and this and this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get it. I get it now. Take me back there to your body. What did it feel like? Well, I was a different person back then. I bet you were. But take me back to her. Take me back to him, right? This is not about we don't need to argue the facts. I get it. I want to know what it felt like. What did you see at one point in that human? And if I can negotiate that, if it's safe enough, and sometimes it isn't, right? If contempt has set in to the point that we can't break through that piece to get to that piece, that's often where it becomes clearer, for me anyways, that this relationship will be difficult to continue. And so what I do find fascinating is if we can get to a place where I can say, tell me about this person. Where did you first meet, right? And often if I can get into much more logistic, practical things rather than emotional things, this helps. And so it would be like, maybe, remember Pat and Irene there, they had that St. Patrick's Day party. That's where we met. Hey, did you remember that? Yeah. And I was there with my brother, and you were there with your sister, and and your brother, and our brothers knew each other, remember? So they introduced us, and like, yeah, that's how we met. So her brother knew my brother, and then we didn't know each other then, and then I saw her and I thought, wow, okay, she's very nice. And then I would say things like this: tell me more. What did you notice? And if you can drop into that emotional place, it doesn't mean it's going to heal anything, but we can get back to the vulnerable places. And in there, we can start to have some conversations. Man, I never, ever, ever spoke to anybody like I spoke to her. We would talk for hours on the phone. Like, do you remember? And if I can get them to turn to each other, if I can get, for example, in this case, him to turn to her or him to turn to him, it does, like this is really irrelevant in terms of same-sex couples, bisexual couples. When we get into this place of two people looking to each other, what I'm really interested most in is the human race, because we all start in exactly the same place. Humans, our DNA, regardless of age, race, religion, socioeconomic status, or gender identity, is 99.96% the same. And so the capacity to slow down long enough, which you can understand in this very noisy world becomes much more difficult, is the trick. And when we've been caught in patterns with our partner, it is sometimes difficult, if not impossible, to be able to do that on our own because we've tried. And the systems in which we've tried tend to be, I'm going to berate you, I'm going to shame you, I'm going to give you the silent treatment, I'm going to tell you you're amazing, and you're not going to respond in a way that I really need you to, so that I'm going to be like, fuck you, I tried. And we get stuck in these patterns. And then the more you shut down, the louder I get, the more louder I get, the more you shut down, or vice versa. The more you become wanting to try to fix it, the more it turns me off, the more it makes me do like this. And that story is deep in my bones. And so just really uncracking that code becomes part of the issue. But you can see, I think what we're up against so much in these days is the capacity that our access to each other will become more and more compromised. Our capacity to slow down, I think, is going to be part of the biggest issue. So, in the notes, I gave you this. There's some things to consider in the new world of relationships. So, if we are over promising and under delivering in this very disconnected and often lonely world, it stands to reason, in my mind, that on purpose, expanding our network to address the connections we need will be vitally important. Are we having deep connections with the people we spend time with at work? Are we feeling that we are maintaining relationships with people in our lives that will be there a long time? Sibling relationships tend to be the longest standing relationship you and I will ever experience. Parents die earlier than we typically outlive our parents. Our children come later. They typically outlive us. Our siblings tend to be the ones that stay the longest. And so do we work at those relationships, staying connected, building those resources so you can have a safe place to land, even when a parent dies or a child becomes unavailable to stay connected to, whatever that looks like. That becomes important. But also developing friendships and maintaining connections where you play in a sports team, but you really know some things about each other, that you sink into things, that you have a place to put the emotions. And I think that's going to be important. Now, researchers have also said that people who have more social resources, more people to talk to about various issues in their lives, do better in marriage. And I think, back to Esther's work, what areas do we want to invest with our partners, and in which areas do we need to invest in ourselves and our personal networks, right? I think those become some really important connections. Now, distress in relationship is centered in the loss of secure emotional connection. Full stop. I'll tell you that one more time. Distress in relationship is centered in the loss of secure emotional connection. And when this happens, a negative cycle, or this dance, develops as each partner tries to cope with the loss of that connection, usually by defending their soul with responses like anger, criticism, distancing, silence, or relationship distractions. Once established, these cycles can crop up over the slightest issue and over time are corrosive to the bonds of trust and security in a relationship. Now, understanding that dance with your own partner can unlock some of the defenses, allowing for the more vulnerable emotions like understanding, compassion, empathy to rise. And in turn, each partner can then express a more loving, compassionate response. For me, becomes the critical end game. Can I be compassionate in my response? And from that that status, decide whether I want to grow old with you. From that state. And God, it's hard work and it's brave work. And it often is difficult because all you have control over is you. This is the kiss of death from Gottman's perspective in relationship has been boiled down to one thing: contempt. In fact, contempt is fueled by long simmering negative thoughts about one's partner. Contempt is like this. Contempt is like, I've heard Logan Uri talk about this. She wrote the book How Not to Die Alone. And it's like the ick, the thing that just makes you go like, eh. That's sort of the breeders of contempt. Okay. When your husband blows your nose like this, and nose like this. When, like, whatever. It usually starts as little things, but then they grow. Okay. And John Gottman describes contempt as far beyond criticism because it indicates a moral superiority over one's partner. And what is so fascinating is that there's a notable change in physiology when we're in a state of contempt for another. I don't think this contempt thing ever happens overnight, but holy smokes, when we don't talk about the little things or even have somewhere to put the things that piss us off, they tend to grow. I'm often amazed that when we find ourselves willing to not talk about things because we don't want to rock the boat, but if we truly knew that a little boat rocking, I talk about this in Feeling Seen, if we truly knew that a little boat rocking every now and then would likely ward off a fucking tsunami in a couple of years, we'd be far more open to the rocking. Okay. And I think, So many people then say, like, where do we start? How do we do this? And I think it's like, it is so often this idea of timing. We tend to want to have some really difficult conversations in the heat of the moment. Bad choices. Bad choices. Okay. When your lid is flipped and another one is flipped, tricky. But that's often when we feel like we're most justified to explain things. We really want to talk about things. We want to, like, you always do this. You always do, no, 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 no. And I think the timing becomes important when you're both regulated and with snacks. Sobriety becomes important to do. We tend to, be more willing or impulsive with our words after we've had a few glasses of wine. And sometimes they are not as clear as we need them to be, particularly when we're talking about really important things. And I think that a conscious uncoupling, which is a very beautiful term that I think a lot of people talk about when they really can come together and decide whether they've grown apart or not, enough and not in this lifetime, will require the vulnerability of two people. And sometimes it's impossible to do. I get that all day long. But I think, typically speaking, if we were to sort of line us up on a start line, and if I had to just give you one answer about this, women will be at the, not all, in all relationships, but women tend to be the ones who will be strongest in this regard, because what it will require, at least in some capacity, is an emotional language, a bravery around trying to use some words to describe what we're feeling and what we're experiencing and what it feels like when certain things have changed in our relationship. Okay. Because I think what happens so much of the time is that when you only have one way to express yourself, right? Sexual intimacy, for example, tends to be the way that how we get back to that state of vulnerability. Men more so than women, those who identify as men, tend to have that as the one way to sort of get back into the state of intimacy. And so every way of, like, connecting to your partner's body that used to work, right? You're so amazing. You're so, like, slapping people on bums and doing all those things that used to be effective when there was a much more open communication. The longer that goes on, there's a contempt that happens in that way, because the story in our head is, that's all I'm worth it for. And if you can't have that conversation, this is all I feel like I'm worthy of, right? I'm nothing in this relationship unless I'm a piece of meat, or, you're condescending to me when we're out with our friends, but oh my God, I'm very important to you. Sex is the only thing that matters here. And oftentimes I find the response when that's said in the presence of the other human, like the man in this case, it's like, wait, what? The only way I feel like we are connected to each other is when we are intimate. And I feel like we've lost that completely, because you're so kind to the kids. You're so thrown into everything else you do. And what we miss the most is, what happened to us. And us, for women, tend to be much more defined outside of the sexual relationship. But when you don't have an emotional language, all you have is the intimacy of the sexual relationship. So another common phenomenon that happens, and how can we rewrite the stories or use the words in there that we don't have? Okay. I think I'm leaving you with the modern relationship, a few things to consider in our notes. Let me just go back and make sure we're still on. So in our busy lives with work and kids and all the things, really about creating opportunities to refocus on each other, recreating the connection. Oh man, Kate, you got it. But I'll let me tell you a little bit more about this, because number one, in this disconnected, often lonely world, one of the things I just want to leave you with tonight is to consider this: one person cannot do it all. Take stock of the expectations you have of your partner and what you need to feel the most competent in your life. We are living longlier. We are living longer and lonelier than we ever have, right? Like, if you even think about, like, 2 generations ago, you had to stay committed and figure the shit out with other people, for maybe 40, 50 years. You can figure it out. Now we're living into our 80s, and like, this is a whole lot longer. This is double the time we got to stay with one person. It's going to take a little more work. And when we are isolated and we feel lonely, even a room full of hundreds of people or big family functions or 6,000 friends on Facebook. It is the capacity to be authentically connected that is going to dictate those of us who feel the most honored in our bodies. And Esther Perel puts this question, right? Are you looking for chemistry for a love story, or are you looking for chemistry for a life story? It's a great question to ask, right? What are we looking for here? In this modern, noisy world, this is what I say, number 3, the importance of acknowledgement has never been more critical. And the people who need it the most are the hardest to give it to. It becomes very difficult to acknowledge a partner when you feel like you're doing it all. When it feels like, she's a hero because she, took the kids to school 3 days in a row or whatever. I'm just kind of making that up. But it's like the acknowledgement is very true. And I take it back to sort of the basics of human behavior. And I feel so lucky to have spent so much time with kids in a psychiatric setting, because we are so much simpler than the complexities of our brain would indicate. When you collect, you direct. Every single human has the capacity for good. Getting us back to that good is often the goal of the most successful relationships in your world. If you can figure out how to get another back to their good and then have the conversation and then do the teaching and then do the ask, this is true of our children and it's very true of our partners. And given our stories, it becomes triggering, complex. It becomes difficult to do when they've been asinine, or, you've had an exchange between people that, were hurtful, or it's harder to sort of get into that place again. I get it. Consider number 4, consider your dance with your partner, your partners. When they get mad, what do they tend to do? When you get mad, what do you tend to do? Be very prepared to change your tactic if it's not working the way you want it to. But first of all, the most critical phase in this whole place is just notice it. Are you a silent treatmenter? Do you run away? Do you talk excessively? Just notice that and wonder about its impact and what it might take to just slightly move the compass needle. And then I put this thing in here because I was really thinking about Logan's book when I was writing this too. Meeting on apps is so difficult. Okay. If you are in this place of trying to, develop a new relationship, do an activity, engage in a social situation that will determine your ability to engage. And this is true with our partners. If we're texting all the time, if we're texting our notes, and which is a beautiful way to stay connected. I think about, when I'm on the road, all the time, the easiest way to stay connected. But the importance of a phone call, the importance of a FaceTime, the importance of being able to have eyes on in that engagement is often important. And 6, I say the long-term relationship has doubled in time over the past few generations. We just talked about this, but I'll explain it again here. Marriage is not the same for men and women. It's new for many homosexual couples. The identity of being able to be married in a homosexual relationship is brand new and not even legal in some places. There is no one size yet, by the way. There's no one size fits all for any one marital relationship. And today we have so many opportunities to build happy, successful, connected communities that will allow us to remain vulnerable to the ones who matter the most to us. I think this is the truth, right? This life, despite the fact that it's doubled in length for some of us, is not meant to be lived lonely. I think it's one of the saddest things of all time because we're neurobiologically wired for connection. What I will caution, and I did add in here, is that ambivalence is part of every relationship. Not feeling 100% connected, not knowing if this was the right one. It's like ambivalence is part of every relationship. Consider this. Perhaps the highest form of love isn't unconditional. Maybe it's closer to, I love this Terry Reel's description of self-esteem, our ability to see ourselves as flawed and still hold ourselves in high regard. can you imagine if this was true? The ability to see your partner as flawed and still hold them in high regard. I think is the key to being able to sort of starting to unlock some of the things that I think we need to talk about these days. So I added a couple. I see we're at time here, but the Dance of Intimacy, State of Affairs, All or Nothing Marriages, Ellie Finkel is lovely. Sovereign Love. This is Danae's book that I'm just almost through. I love lots of resources and opportunities to kind of have these conversations that I think is really critical. But I think we got the notes figured out. But I think that's really, it for me, that we are in a time where being able to stay connected on purpose to get back to not just like we go on a date and everybody's on their phone, okay, we're connected. I think the ability to get people back to their authentic and vulnerable states is going to require the looking and the seeing. Ooh, Catherine, I love that question. Okay, so we're going to jump into a few questions now. Is the feeling of indifference the same as contempt? Can a couple recover when they say they feel indifferent to you? Ooh, that is the best question of all time. And I think, well, maybe not of all time, but let me just say indifference. Contempt for me is so much bigger. And this might just be, I just Googled this because I really want to make sure I got this right. Indifference is not caring for others' sentiments. Contempt is always to have a negative opinion of others. Okay, so like for me, indifference feels much more blasé. Contempt is like vitriol. Okay, I would say as a couples therapist, I can work with indifference much more than I can work with contempt or hate or despising of another. Indifference is really, I think, the ambivalence that often sets in. My question becomes why and what is the story around it, which is often something to explore if you can with a therapist, but really like, you know, the capacity to sort of say things like, well, where do you feel it in your body becomes important. Also, what are the things that you love best about me? What are the things that I at one point loved best about you? What has changed in that regard? So I think there's a big difference of between indifference and contempt. I hope that helps.
You want some of my udders?
I do want some of your udders. Yeah. Thank you. Marty's got some questions for me too. And I see there's one from Andrea here.
I might have that one on here. Was it Catherine's?
Yeah, you do. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is another one. How would you address long-term marriages 20 plus years where interest activities do not align? The other partner is not willing or able to participate in these things. Okay, so here's what I love about as we age, particularly when I watch people age in different capacities, right? So illness takes over, physical abilities take over, the idea to sort of, I want to travel, you don't, but I still love so much about you. Um, but I want to do these things with other people. I think that you get to decide between the two of you whether those are deal breakers. I think what becomes really interesting again is this capacity in a regulated place to be like, what does it feel like when, what would it feel like if I wanted to travel without you? What would it feel like if you wanted to stay home and I wasn't here? I think that when you've been with somebody that long, the question is, are there pieces there that are still the things that you can't live without? Those are the questions, right? Is like, what are the good stuff that still lives here? If it's simply activities that we want to do differently, I think the idea of staying together and loving everything about each other and what we love, I don't think that's normal, particularly as we age. Here's full permission to like things entirely different than your partner and to do things in entirely different ways. I think, there's such a sentiment around long-term relationships in this negative capacity. We're just dragging each other along. This is the ball and chain, or happy life, happy wife. I'm just trying to keep her happy. I'm just trying to keep him happy. Fuck that. the idea around a connected relationship, we now have the opportunity to be the best partner if we're happy within ourselves. There was another quote. Can I just see Danae's book here real quick? There's another quote in here that I just like, oh, I just about lost. And I wish I could have saved for you because it just took my breath away today. When one is pretending, this is by Anaïs Nin, when one is pretending, the entire body revolts. So when we are not being authentic to ourselves, when we're feeling like, and there's always some sense of, obligation, connection to like, okay, if this, whatever. But I love the idea of being true to yourself too. If there's something that you really want to get out of this life, and I'm using travel as an example, my gosh, we are better partners if we can be honest and clear about those things. If that becomes a deal breaker, then you step into it. But I think the honesty and the clarity around that becomes so critically important. My love language is physical touch, and my husband is acts of service. How do I appropriately remind my husband of my love language so that it doesn't come across as being a nag? We have done therapy together, and the counselor's advice is to think of date night like scheduling business meetings. Okay. You have to book them on a monthly basis. This never happens. How do I get my husband on board with date nights? We do a lot of stuff together as a family or with friends, but never book time to prioritize ourselves and our relationship. I think that, so one of the things that I think we mistake these days, and I could be wrong because again, the context isn't, I don't have the same context as your therapist does. I think what I want you to think about is, where is there a shared joy? Where do you belly laugh together? What do you do? And if it's not scheduled, how do you find those moments? Because I think that if it is, the love languages I'm kind of falling out of love with, but it has helped so many people understand that even if I'm not communicating, if you're not communicating with me in the same way as I'm communicating with you, it still means something very different. And I think it's like, where we are most vulnerable is when we are feeling our most joy. Joy is the most vulnerable emotion on the planet. And so it's like, how do we create situations where those things are happening? And oftentimes it is when we are, spending time together, even when it is with our families, even when it is in this place of, doing things for another, grabbing the hand as a result of trying to get eyes on. One of the things that I think become really critical is not necessarily, we set ourselves up so much for the date night and this is what we're supposed to be doing, and it's stupid. They're on their phones, we're on ours. This is fucking dumb. Why are we even doing this? And that works for some people, but sometimes it becomes a disaster. And so what I would say is that just find little moments during the day, try to create them on purpose instead of one big situation. Look what happens when you get eye contact with them in a room and nobody else knows, right? When your kid does something ridiculous, or the knowing between you when, the mother-in-law says something and you're like, mm-hmm. It is those sort of pieces that I think become much more solidifying in a relationship than trying to create a schedule that, because here's what I love about your thing. You book the monthly and it never happens. Okay, so that's not working. Now, the story about in our head is, we don't know, is it going to be difficult? Is she going to bring up a whole bunch of shit? I don't want to go on this. Like, oh, shoot, it didn't happen again. When we start to build in those little ones, again, you do so many things together already. Do them on purpose. Find those little moments together that I think is usually much more conceivable than sort of setting that time apart and setting out for this great big expectation that this date's going to be just fucking roses and sunshine. How do we become more connected in a relationship that has not moved into marriage after several years? Great question, Candace. On purpose. I would say that some of the most important ways of figuring out some of those conversations is, really what is getting in the way of us moving forward? What are we scared of? But often when we have those conversations become the most critical, about even more critical than whether we have them or not, right? Because if we do them when we're feeling overwhelmed or sad or lost or incompetent in our own bodies, they come off like, do you even love me? Do you even give a shit about me? We've been doing this for like 5 years and we're not moving forward. Like, what's the deal? Right. And that becomes so difficult to answer versus here's the thing I love the most about you. And there are days where I think that I can't imagine not growing old with you. And it's interesting because there is some significant data around the switch in connection that happens when couples maintain a connected experience or just like a dating experience versus getting married. And there's often a history of commitment issues. There's often not issues, but stories that when that commitment happens, it's over. That's not true. But when that's in our bones, it plays out in our interactions. So I would say much more collection in the process of having that conversation will give you some insight into how and why we're there. Okay, so one little up thing here. I'm going to see B. Mega multitasking tonight. Oilers game on the TV, Dr. Jody on the computer, and watching my nephew's baseball on the phone, and he got a home run. B. This is what's important in your relationship. Okay, when we got all the things going in all the different directions, it becomes very hard to stay connected. And you're one of the best connectors of all time, so I know you know the answers, but it's true. This is what's happening in our lives these days. Right? So we can fight it and say this is the problem, or we can figure out how to navigate it, which I think we're all more than capable of doing. B. And your other half is tuning in on another TV. Oh, E and B. All right, Sherry. One last question I think we got here. Hi, Jody. Sometimes when I let the situation cool before discussing the issue, I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to bring up the issue because I don't want to start the fight again. How do I navigate that? Ooh, Sherry. I love this question, which is probably one of the most significant demises of relationships. Because we just let sleeping dogs lie, which is, I think, probably a term older than dirt. But it's again the idea of even at the end of an argument, a fight, to say we're going to need to. I'm going to need to talk this through again, and I know now is not the time, but we're going to try again and again and again to get back to it. And I think the timing, Sherry, is really critical. It is in a place where if you can swing it, right? The emotion's not big. There's snacks. There's a regulating opportunity. And even in navigating that conversation, I would always try my best to collect before directing, right? This is really where people in relationships who tend to navigate them better. And like I do this way better when I'm doing this with a couple than I've ever done in my own relationship. And Aaron will attest to this significantly. But the acknowledgement of another is and will always be your greatest superpower. When you feel scorned or hurt or that it shouldn't be your job, it makes it even harder to do those things. But I promise you, when you can connect before you direct, it's important. Here's what I love about you. I so appreciate this. I saw you today with our son, and I just thought he is so lucky to have you. And when I look around this, this thing that we've built, or when I watched you today at work, or like whatever the deal is, when you're coaching our kid hockey, somebody told me this about you today, and I just thought about, how proud I am of you. I don't know if I tell you that enough. From that place, it is then, and you know what I worry about a little bit is, when we had that disagreement yesterday, and it might then really quickly go into like, oh, this again, and you can say, "No, I need to have this conversation for me, and I know it might be uncomfortable for you, but can you do this for me? Give me 5 minutes. That's all I need." Okay, fine. We can set the timer if we want. I need some clarity around this because I don't know what this means when you say these things. And oftentimes, staying regulated in some of those conversations is the most difficult ever and sometimes impossible. And that's fair too. But I do know that what will remain one of our greatest superpowers in any relationship where we've been intimate with somebody, where we have, it's been longer than, I don't know, a few months, if certainly if we procreated or shared the lives of our family systems with another, the ability to acknowledge the other will be critical. Will always hold power. Always hold power. Always, always, always. Okay, always snacks and water. You use it all the time, Cher. I know you're amazing. And it is the repetitive nature of this. This isn't a one shot deal, which is why relationships are so fucking exhausting. It's never a one. This growth thing is exhausting. It's so hard. And with some people, it feels easier, but I promise you, um, the deeper a relationship goes, the more difficult it will become. And that's okay. That's okay. We deserve the depth of relationship in this lifetime. We deserve it. So I think that's it. I don't think there's any more, Marty. Any more questions on your part? Okay. Okay, one more here. I feel like sometimes being emotionally regulated is not being my authentic self. Sometimes I want to share that my lid is flipped with my partner. Fucking rights, Paige. This doesn't mean that you can't say, right now I'm losing my fucking mind. This was the most hurtful, audacious thing you've ever done or ever did to me. You need to know that I am busted. And that is equally as important. Okay. Sometimes doing it in a place where we are spewing it in the face of another becomes really difficult to maintain, particularly if their emotional regulation strategies are also off the chart. I often say this to couples, and I tell you this because it is probably the one time I did this with Aaron was probably one of the TSN turning points in our marriage. It was probably the lowest we were at, and I was like, oh, holy fuck, this might be over. And I said to him, I I need to write this out. And here's what I'm scared. So I wrote it out. Here's what I'm scared about. And I think I can't remember if I asked him to do this or he just did it on his own. Um, but then we read the letters to each other, and we weren't allowed to like lose our mind. We did this once in our relationship. It was the best thing we ever did in that moment, because sometimes, particularly if you have a partner that doesn't have a fantastic expressive language, they can't think on their feet, they can't like the problem with some of us is that we're very cutting with our words, and we can be quick on our feet and we can be doing that. Other times we need to give our partners time to think and process, and they feel beat up in our exchanges because we're quicker with our words. And so sometimes even taking the time to write them out means that they'll be in, how do you say, like implemented. They can be taken in that way. And I think the issue is sometimes it is a relentless pursuit of connection, that for the ones that matter, the ones that will need to be maintained. And if you have kids with anybody, you will be in a relationship in some capacity for the rest of your life. If you have been married or in a long-term relationship, you will matter to that other for the rest of your life. And you will hold the capacity to simply acknowledge first. It will be your superpower, even when there's been significant hurt and pain. I promise. I promise, I promise, I promise. Okay, I hope that's helped. I don't see any more questions. Go catch the third period, B. Go Oilers. But thank you. Thank you for showing up tonight. As always, this is like, my favorite part of the month. We will take a break in July and August because I know that most people in our community have so many things going on, and I want you to sink into your families and your people, and you become the most important, of course, on this planet. So this podcast will continue. So if you want to check into this community, always the newsletter is always there. Make sure you're on our list because this community is just becoming more and more sacred to me. And so all the greatest things I always keep there. But every Thursday there'll be a podcast drop, and then starting in September we'll have a whole new set of what do you call it? Clinical workshop topics. And yes, in the meantime, this will be up so you can see this. You have a 7-day rewatch. And I'm just so grateful for you. So drop your shoulders, hang on to your people. That is why we are on this planet. Do your very best to be authentic and connected. And mostly more than anybody else, authentic and connected to you, because that's where all the goodness lives the most. So take care of each other. And I hope to see you again really soon. Bye for now.